I'm Esty Bagos. I'm the managing curator of Ateneo Art Gallery, and thank you for joining us today. We currently have two classes with us. Sorry, I'm catching we have two classes with us. My class, the design research class, and we have the class on creative practice with Alfred Maricilla. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Anna Bernice de los Reyes, who is the co-founder of Sa Tahanan Co. She's currently based between Berlin, Dubai, and Manila. So I'll leave her to introduce what she does. So Bernice, let's give her a hand.
Thank you guys for waiting. I left my house at 7 a.m. thinking I'd get here at 8. So thank you for your patience. Good morning. So my name is Anna Bernice. You can call me Bernice. I am a curator, writer, and a communication strategist. And I also co-founded the art collective Sa Tahanan Co. I think it's one of the kind of founding things I'm going to talk about today, but really talking about my experience working as a diaspora curator and writer. We started in 2020 as a way to uplift and platform Filipino artists in the diaspora and to create more representation of Filipino artists. First within the Gulf, and now that me and my co-founder are based in Germany, continuing to expand our networks within Europe, UK, and the US as well. But more on this later. I wanted to perhaps, how do I go back to the next slide? Oh, here. Maybe to start a little bit about the Filipino migration and context, and thinking about why and how we exist in the diaspora. So currently we have around like 10.8 million Filipino workers who live abroad. A lot of them, as you can see in the graph, are permanent migrants. A lot are also temporary migrants, and there's a small percentage of undocumented immigrants. Obviously, a lot of this data is kind of a plus or minus because it's quite hard actually to get accurate statistics of Filipino immigrants abroad. Interestingly enough, but not surprisingly, more than half are female, working in a lot of the hospitality industries and domestic help. More importantly, maybe if you don't see it, I'm gonna move a little bit. Migrant labor and labor export is a huge contributor to our gross national income and our GDP. Filipinos abroad remit about 2.2 trillion pesos every year, at least as of 2024. And a lot of household incomes in the Philippines come from remittances that are coming from abroad. So that's why I think there's also a huge push. Maybe if you hear a lot of the speeches that are being given, especially these days, about kind of the importance of Filipino migrants to our economy. But I think within our practice, we really want to ask why. Like, why is this rhetoric continually pushed in the linguistics and the way that we communicate about Filipino migrants abroad? So I started my practice as a curator in the Gulf. I went to university in the United Arab Emirates, which really exposed me to a different way of interacting with people and also understanding kind of the geopolitics of the world. It also allowed me to understand that a huge population of the Gulf is actually made up of Filipinos, and we are a big part of how the Gulf has become the region that it is today. A lot of this is catalyzed by the 1974 Labor Code that was put in place by the then President Marcos Sr. And really positioning the Philippines as a huge source of labor export. A lot of it also comes from the fact that, of course, as we all know, we were colonized by the Americans. We speak good English. A lot of that is part of that as well. But it was also catalyzed by the Gulf oil boom in the 70s that was running parallel to this and really needed a lot of high-skilled labor workers in the region. And so a lot of this was happening in parallel and propelled a lot of Filipinos to move to the Gulf, mainly the UAE, Kuwait, and Saudi. And so when you're there, you really see that talagang parang Pinoy talaga, parang nasa Pilipinas ka pag nandun ka. So yeah, like as I said, I started my practice as a curator and a writer in the UAE because I went to university there. It's an interesting place to curate because 90% of the people that live there are actually foreigners, with Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis being the top population, and the local population, the Emiratis, only really make up 10%. So it really is a place of migration and a place where diasporas thrive. As I mentioned, because there's a lot of people that moved there in the 70s, people have eventually like brought their wives and their husbands and their children to this country and ended up creating different enclaves and different kind of like microcultures and micro communities also of different nationalities that really make the UAE kind of like a melting pot of cultures. And because of the kind of minority of the locals, there's a new kind of third culture that is created by the fact that majority of the population are migrants. And within the UAE, it's actually around 6% Filipino, and in Dubai specifically, there's like around 20% Filipinos. And as a curator, this really decenters your perspectives about identity and belonging and integration and assimilation and all of these things that maybe you would learn in like your migrant study courses, that is really decentered from the West, or conversations about like Western ideals of migration. So that's kind of the starting point of how I kind of think about curating as a way of archiving or as a way of researching how identities transform and exist in the diaspora. Yeah, like as I said, as a starting point, I was able to learn a lot about the nuances also of the histories of the Arab region through taking specific art history and curating classes in the UAE, and this really was my starting point to understanding art making and artists as historians and contemporary historians, especially through the lenses of a lot of the Arab artists whose works that we got to present. This was my curatorial class in university, and a lot of these artists document a lot of personal narratives and personal perspectives that maybe you wouldn't read in history books or watch in documentaries. So this kind of emphasized to me how the personal is political, and the personal narratives of people who live through a lot of catastrophes and war and geopolitical tension really exists as a very important kind of archive of how the world changes and how history is created beyond kind of the Western writing or the way the media writes about the way that the world works. And then, yeah, so these are just some examples of exhibitions that I've done where really we are in dialogue with other people from other diasporas that are largely not white or not Western, and really being in dialogue with a lot of other narratives of colonialism and imperialism and post-colonial migration through interacting with other people that are also immigrants. Another example also of an exhibition that I worked with where I was looking at other artists who deal with this yearning for a home that does not exist. And a lot of these artists are from, again, different diasporas in the Arab region, but also South Asia and Southeast Asia. And as a journalist, I've been able to also look at how living in temporality or how living in transience in the UAE also shape the practices of artists, especially with photography. There's a lot of photographers that work in the Gulf region and the UAE that kind of document a lot of the changes that are happening whether in like mundane spaces or in kind of like macro spaces as well. So again, just as an example of really how, for me at least, living in the UAE has decentered the way that I see the world away from perhaps the Western lens. And so around this time was when I started, so around 2020, I met Augustine Paredes. And I was quite shocked to meet a Filipino artist who was already practicing in the UAE. And so I asked him if Dubai is 20% Filipino, is the arts and culture scene also 20% Filipino? Because for me, the art space and the culture institution should be reflective of the population or the constellation of people in a city or in a country. And for me, at least at the time, I didn't see any representation of Filipinos within the art spaces, even if Filipinos make up like a large portion of the population, also of the labor force. And so I was kind of yearning for that to be seen. Like I don't see myself on the walls. So that kind of became the start of us thinking about how we can perhaps platform Filipino artists within the Gulf diaspora. Around the same time, it was also COVID, and there was the huge Ulysses and Rolly typhoon that was happening in the Philippines. And because we were not with our families and were away from our home country, it kind of felt so futile to just donate and whatever money that we had, and there was a sense of bayanihan that we wanted to instigate also, of like what can we do more as a community to perhaps create a bigger impact towards, at least, the least that we can do is to donate. And so the collective started with us doing our first exhibition as an art sale. We were very fortunate to kind of use our cold emailing skills and asked an institution to maybe help us fund the exhibition. So because it was COVID, this art space called Al Sarkal Avenue had some spare warehouses that were not in use. So they kindly lent us the space, and we got some funding also from smaller donors to be able to put up a show in, I think, 2 weeks. So it was quick. It was really kind of a response towards really what was going on in the Philippines and this desire to help, even if obviously we knew that it was a short-term help. So that's how Sa Tahanan kind of started. I think at the time we were able to raise like 37,300 pesos, because also we were trying to reimagine a different way of doing art sales. So we gave all the artists a option of how they want to use the money. So it was either 70-30, 70 towards them and 30% towards donation, 50-50 or 30-70. So really kind of giving the artists the agency to be able to decide where their money goes, whereas the gallery system, obviously, as some of you may know, is 50-50. I mean, we're not a gallery, so we wanted to reimagine a different way of, just how we maybe work in the market. It was, our first exhibition was very exciting because there were so many Filipinos that came into the space. It was also COVID, as you can see, everyone was wearing masks. And we also had poetry and a short film festival. And that's when we really started seeing the gallery space and the art space really as a place to gather, or as a place for people to tambay. Because we kept the doors open and people were just hanging out and obviously supporting their fellow artists. But yeah, it really became a space where you can hear so many, like it really was a lot of Filipinos coming into the space, and we were told that this was the first time in a long time that they felt that there was some representation in these art spaces for them. I mean, before us, there was an art collective called the Brown Monkeys, who, because of the transient nature of the UAE, eventually started disbanding because they either moved away from the UAE or transitioned to something else. So they were a collective that existed until about, I think, 2018. And I guess we kind of continued the legacy that they left behind. Again, the interesting and exciting thing about being in the UAE amongst a lot of people from different diasporas is we also got to get to be in conversation with other art collectives who are representing their own diasporas, and the conversation around migration and our identities as people away from our homeland is a constant conversation also with other art practitioners, because it's just so common for people who live there to be not from there, and so the conversations become rich, and we were able to have deeper conversations about what it means to exist in the diaspora, and maybe do a little bit of a compare and contrast as to the reasons why, both personal and like political and systemic reasons why we ended up immigrating to the UAE or migrating in general. So these are just some examples of talks that we participated in and like roundtable discussions that we participated in, to really understand Filipino migration within the global context also of like post-colonial discourse. After that, we started doing a lot of public programming, both online and in person, really looking at poetry as a way to communicate. So we had a program called Filipino Poets and Their Poems, where we would be invited by galleries and museums to interpret or kind of respond to their exhibitions through poetry, and we would do these guided poetry walks through exhibition spaces. We were super fortunate to be able to respond to Pasita Abad's solo exhibition, I think a couple of years ago. If you don't know her practice, a lot of her work also deals with Filipino culture in the diaspora, and she was also quite a nomadic artist who was making work largely outside of the country. And so it was really important for us to be in dialogue with her works, especially after decades have passed and kind of a new wave of Filipino immigrants are responding to the topics that she presents in a lot of her work. We have also been able to integrate the nuances of talking about the Filipino cultural or creative diaspora within academic discourse. We were able to integrate some artists in different academic journals, in academic archives, and in conferences. So really thinking about why is it important for a Filipino art collective to exist in the UAE, and what does it mean for representation of our existence within these spaces through art making. More importantly, at the core of it for us is creating a community and connecting different artists with each other who are able to share resources and kind of insights and help each other in different ways. We also have a WhatsApp group chat underlying a lot of these programming that we do, for people to share resources with each other, to hire each other at different gigs and different creative commercial endeavors, but also to make work with each other. Often we get approached by other artists to be connected with other artists, not just now in the Gulf, but also outside, and how this network really allows us to just create a community and a sense of belonging amongst like Filipinos who are making work abroad. I think it's also important to mention that a lot of these artists that we work with have full-time jobs and exist in the diaspora also as labor workers in different fields. And so their practice really exists in parallel to them having that lived experience of work, of labor. And I think for a lot of the work that we do was the program called Cooking from a Migrant Memory, or Ang Pagluluto sa Linamnam ng Alaala, where we were able to start integrating perspectives of Filipino practitioners, artists, curators from outside of the Gulf to be in conversation with the cultural institutions and creative practices within the Gulf. So for this first iteration, at least, we picked 2 artists from kind of the North American diaspora, the Arab diaspora, and the European diaspora to share recipes from their childhood or from their upbringing that reminds them of home. And we interviewed them to understand why these recipes were important to them and why and how maybe these recipes have changed as a result of their geographic placements. So, for example, in the U.S., James Clark was telling us about how Mongo Guisado was really this kind of nurturing and kind of warm meal that his mom would cook, but then also because there's some ingredients that wouldn't exist and it would get replaced by other ingredients. There's a lot of similar kind of undertones of that with other recipes as well, especially for Jupa Balete, for example, who was raised in Saudi, and her mom had to also kind of figure out different ways of cooking Filipino food with different ingredients from the Gulf. And so what we did was we took these 6 recipes and then we cooked them as part of a kind of a Kamayan performance in the Biennale in Diriyah in 2024, which was again kind of a remanifestation of a lot of these recipes, because again we were recontextualizing them in the Saudi context. So for example, Stephanie gave us her spam silog recipe, but there's no pork spam in Saudi, so we used, I think, turkey spam or chicken spam. So really thinking about how these recipes become a metaphor for how the immigrant body also shapeshifts and changes and is forced to adapt to different contexts that they exist in, and really looking at food and ways of cooking as a way to understand perhaps how the migrant diaspora exists outside of the homeland. So this was a 3-day kind of cooking performance that we did, and actually became the start of one of our artists, Jupa Balate, to look into the, how do you call this, the diaries and cooking cookbooks that her mom left behind. So her mom moved to Saudi Arabia, I think in the 1980s, even before a lot of this modernization and the way that Saudi is now. So she lived there for 3 decades and was actually keeping a recipe cookbook. And in parallel, there were these diary entries right next to it. So she has like 3 decades worth of these of this archive. It's really like a history archive of how Filipinos existed through that time, from her personal stories and from her recipes. More on that later, because that appears again in one of our programs. This performance program as well, I don't know if you can really see it in the screen, we also started exploring also performance and dance and poetry and video also with a few artists from the UAE, really asking them to explore how home exists in their body, and how for a lot of people who are immigrants, the way that we look at our body as home exists differently. And that was the prompt for this program. So this was our program from the Sharjah Biennial last year, where we worked with 8 artists to do a performance program within the context of the biennial. Again, food really is a big part of how we look at how we research and archive. This was a exhibition we did just last year called Sa Tahanan Co, which beyond food, we were looking at Filipino supermarkets and grocery stores, and the architecture of that, infrastructure of that as an export also of Filipino culture and how these grocery stores and supermarkets really become kind of the band-aid for homesickness for a lot of Filipinos. So we also commissioned, all the way to the left, two artists to look at also the export economy of Filipino goods abroad by way of looking at the tingi economy, and they translated that into this art installation, looking at the different products that exist in the Filipino supermarkets. We also had a film screening of a docufiction film by Jam Moreno, who is from Davao, looking at the sari-sari store economy also that actually his mom runs in Davao. And the images on the right that you see are, the prompt that we gave the artist is what is in your Filipino grocery list, and that's their interpretation of that prompt. So looking at different ways in which Filipino food or Filipino goods becomes a way of temporary comfort for again Filipinos who are abroad, and kind of translating that into these photographs. For us also, art making is a way of honoring legacies and really researching deeper into the undocumented Filipino experience abroad. So the curator, Murtaza Valley, approached us because he found out that Modesh, this mascot, famous mascot in the UAE, kind of like our Jollibee here, was actually created by a Filipino artist named Robbie McLeod. And this was not really widely known until he passed away in 2018, and that he actually created a huge legacy of Filipino illustrators and designers in the country. And I actually didn't know about this either until this curator approached us about it. And it was very haunting for me because it made me think about how much more impact or kind of contributions Filipino creatives have brought into the UAE that is largely kind of undocumented or unwritten, not to anyone's fault, but also because of the way that the region also has been growing so rapidly. A lot of these footprints are kind of missed along the way. So as a way of honoring his legacy, we created this art installation that really refers back to the way in which tourism perhaps is sold or kind of capitalized within the UAE context. So just going back, Modesh is a mascot for Dubai Summer Surprises, which is a huge summer kind of shopping campaign intended for people to at least want to stay in the UAE in the hot summer months. So it's kind of part of a larger tourism and shopping campaign to which a lot of Filipinos contribute to visually. And a lot of that labor again is lost in the commercial and kind of the capitalist sense of it all. And a lot of artists kind of disappear into, their names are basically just not acknowledged in a lot of these designs. So we created this art installation and also wrote about his legacy on the left. We commissioned a Filipino writer, Alexander Chavez, to kind of look maybe deeper into his existence in the UAE and the legacy that he's left behind. And again, going back to Cooking from a Migrant Memory, so this was another exhibition that we did last November, where we started again bringing a lot of voices from Berlin specifically, I suppose, and Frankfurt in conversation with artists in the UAE, and particularly this food installation in the middle, where we partnered Jupa Balate with Alexis Convento, who is a Filipino-American culinary artist now based in Berlin. to reimagine her mother's recipes into kind of a ceremonial art installation. So this entire installation is actually edible. And I'm sharing a little bit of pages from their brainstorm and how a lot of how they've transformed the nuances of Drew's mother's recipes into form, into this kind of ceremonial food installation that was actually also edible, and really looking at how, again, like the personal and the all of these different stories really function as an archive of our existence abroad, and how a lot of these are not not really in history books, but are equally as important. I mean, these recipes and her diary entries not just show like the typical kind of stereotype of the pain and labor of working abroad, but also a lot of the joy and a lot of the togetherness and a lot of the celebration that also exists in a lot of the diasporas that exist within this constellation. And lastly, our latest exhibition was actually here at Art Fair Philippines, where it really was a kind of a symbolic coming home for a lot of the artists that we work with, really looking at how perhaps distance and the existence abroad allows us to really critically examine why we exist abroad in the first place. So we brought 5 different artists from the diaspora, actually from Europe this time, who have kind of interconnected ways of introspecting and questioning also kind of the structures that exist for keeping us abroad, and maybe also looking at how these colonial powers or colonial impacts also keep a lot of our archives and a lot of our objects outside of the Philippines, and also how these structures continue to keep us working and remitting to the Philippines. And I think a lot of these kind of function as a community who support and kind of motivate each other and help each other through the nuances of being an immigrant in Berlin. And also a lot of us are freelance artists as well, and so navigating the second layer of that. On the topic of food, a lot of the reason why we started gathering together is there's no really good Filipino restaurants in Berlin, so we actually just started cooking for each other, and a dinner of 3 became 5, and it became 20, and it became kind of even bigger than that. So a lot of that has kind of spilled into that thinking of how us as diaspora kind of need to stick with each other and maybe formulate new conversations and critical thinking about how and why we exist outside of our homeland. I think for me it's very critical personally, and also as a curator, to really understand the nuances of personal narratives as part of a larger kind of historic understanding of movement and migration. So outside also my very keen look into the Filipino practices abroad, again in dialogue with other diasporas. Berlin also offers at least for me, like a larger understanding again of these like kind of common systemic patterns of why there's so many diasporas abroad. And for me, a way for me to really understand that and critically think through that is through art exhibitions and to interacting also with artists that exist in their own diasporas. And so as a journalist, I'm really interested in going deeper into that and kind of understanding these kind of like social political contexts within the inquiries of artists. Yeah. I think that's pretty much it. I think I am done talking.
Thank you, Bernice. We'll now open the floor for questions. questions from our audience. Maybe you guys have some questions you'd like to ask Bernice.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Hi, I'm Sai. I actually worked as an OFW in Maldives for like 3 years, and parallel to that, I was also like practicing as an artist and a printmaker. I came home for good last month, but then I wanted to ask anyway, because there is some similarities with UAE and the Maldives in terms of like the diaspora. I think around half of the population in the Maldives right now is made up of diaspora, also from South Asia, like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lankans, and Filipinos also. So I do share the same sentiments of like lacking representation, but I think one thing I noticed is that in the Maldives, the art scene there or the institutions there aren't any, or there are very few in place to help kind of create these conversations. So I wanted to ask, like, how can we get started in places like these, especially if we don't have access to a good community there, or we don't necessarily have the funding? Because even if we do, like, I have already began collaborating with some Maldivian artists, but they also do face the same issues of lacking representation, lacking access to funding or other organizations to help them create these like exhibitions or any sort of conversations to engage more with the diaspora or to create art in the Maldives. Sorry, that was a bit long.
I don't know the context fully in the Maldives, aside from it's a beautiful coastal place with a really nice beach. But actually I do have a collective that I think I can put you in touch with who is doing work in, I forgot which other island that is. But I'll look for it and I'll send it to you. But from talking to her, I think the idea is to just really come together and come together often, and I mean, it's so like futile to say, but to really just create without the pressure of, at least for me, like exhibiting. When we put together our first show, it was really, I'm such a perfectionist and I want everything to like be perfect, and really letting go of whatever preconceived ideas we have of like creating an exhibition. I do think now as well that the white cube and like white wall spaces are not the only places to like exhibit work. There's a lot of alternative spaces to show work. It can be in your apartment, it can be like in someone's living room. Like one of the exhibitions that I did was in a restaurant, because the owner is an artist and also an art collector and wanted to just provide spaces. So really thinking beyond like an empty white cube and a white gallery space as a place for exhibition making, I think was really important for us to kind of just start and to get things going. I mean, in the beginning also of my practice, we were just curating in like warehouses and doing a lot of works in progress. So actually the exhibition that I showed after the beep was as a curatorial experiment where we just put out an open call on Instagram where we put up one work by one artist and then asked 2 artists to respond to that work, and had 48 hours to make the work, and whatever is finished in 48 hours is going to get put up. And it really releases this like stress of having to make something perfect or make something look good in order to exhibit it and really kind of go back to the sense of play and the sense of creativity that really exists in making work. So I think in this show we had like 38 artists, and it was super like low-key, like low maintenance. Like we used this warehouse space, had a few people come in and help with like literally like nails and hammers. And it was really kind of a bayanihan as well. So I think the answer to that is really community and looking at resources beyond money that we can give towards each other in the absence of like financial backing, and really looking at alternatives of like, what do I have in front of me that I can like not make do, but like like make do with as a start to like to start that momentum. Because even to this day, Sa Tahanan, we don't have money, like zero. We only really function from being able to get these commissions. Otherwise, we don't really have like funds. It comes from us actually, like me and Augustine, just kind of funding some of the like petty things that we would need to pay for. And that also comes from us also having jobs and having to balance this all also on top of our jobs. So I think that's what I would say, I think, is to just start and to not be intimidated by this like, big idea of having to do a show, but really looking at making as an experiment. And once you get into that, there's a sense of play that comes in and it makes it exciting, and maybe like a little bit more resourceful in terms of how you can make work happen. Obviously it's not ideal, but maybe that answers your question.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Via, and I'm just curious with what's going on, with the war going on in the UAE right now. I just want to know what would be the important role to play of the Filipino diasporic art with what's going on right now.
Yeah, it's very fresh. I think a lot of the artists that exist, so what I find interesting working with artists who have like lived experiences as labor workers is a lot of that eventually fuels into their work. And to me, whatever work we see that comes out of this will become an archive of this time. Whether it's through, kind of capturing things literally through photographs, or through capturing the emotional experiences that they're going through. Whatever work that comes out of this time will be an archive and will be like a moment to perhaps document history. And so I do think that they play a huge role in what happens from this and after this, because whatever work they create inevitably becomes a response to what they're experiencing. In this time where a lot of information and the way that things are interpreted are manipulated by different perspectives, and still to this day like a lot of like Western perspectives, I think the Filipino kind of lens and whatever Filipino artists make at this time become very critical into looking at the nuances of how Filipinos exist in the region, especially in times of turmoil.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm a first-year Diplomacy and International Relations student here, so kind of a timely kind of question. Sa Tahanan Co focuses on art from Filipino creators in the UAE and Gulf region, and then you mentioned a project where you were able to collaborate with artists from the North American and from the European regions. Since the Gulf region, as you mentioned, is a relatively diverse region compared to the North American and European regions, especially with the white homogeneous culture in those other regions, I wanted to ask, if you were to interpret, what was the biggest difference you saw in the art produced by artists from the Gulf and UAE region compared to the North American artists, and what was the biggest similarity that you found?
Maybe the biggest difference is the culture of assimilation. I think in the US, a lot of Filipino immigrants eventually, again, I'm not a migrant studies professor, so, don't take my word for gold, but because the Filipino diaspora has existed in the US for a very, very long time, like you could trace it back early 1900s, or perhaps even earlier than that, from the first wave of Filipino migration. So there has now become like perhaps like centuries old of like kind of a subculture of Filipino culture that exists in the US, whereas in the Gulf it's relatively new. And a lot again of the context and existence of Filipinos in the Gulf is rooted in labor export. And also rooted in the fact that, again, as I said, a lot of at least focusing on the UAE, are migrants, 90%, right? So that inevitably influences how Filipinos exist in the region. So I think for me, there's a lot, at least with the, I don't work too much with artists from North America, so I can't really say like for sure, but at least in the Gulf, there's really a lot of nuanced thinking about how like we exist as like labor exports and kind of that product also of our bodies and our work as the export, and how we are also trying to exist outside of that labeling, and also trying to understand our existence as like, yes, I work there, and maybe also how their practice doesn't have to reflect this or have to romanticize this suffering, or kind of really look at their existence in a more human and nuanced way than just kind of romanticizing like the katas ng Saudi or katas ng UAE. Perhaps it's also a way to capture joy or capture longing and capture yearning for the homeland. But also, as you can see through the recipes, of also how being abroad causes also a sense of change, and how we adapt to that change. At least specifically when we were working with artists from Saudi, it was really interesting for me to get to know a little bit more about like the Muslim population that's moved to the Gulf. As someone who grew up in Manila, I don't have as much exposure to kind of the Muslim communities here, and so it was really interesting talking to Eman Tamano and Jupa Balate and understanding actually like the other subcultures of Filipino Muslims that moved to the Gulf, and also how the food that they eat or the food that they cook is also reflective of that. And it also just made me realize that the Filipino existence is really not a monolith, even within our country, because the food that I eat as Filipino is different from the food that people from different regions eat, and I think you can see a lot of that in Saudi, for example, where there's a lot more commonalities in the food in the southern region, as also the food that is also eaten by like South Asian cuisine, and also like Khaliji cuisine. And so I think a lot of that is, at least for me, is something that I am continually learning, and so that's why I like think of my curatorial practice as really research, because I'm also learning a lot about our kind of plurality as a Filipino culture, and maybe allowing me also to understand the depth and the nuances to the Filipino identity beyond just what I learned like growing up in Manila. So I think maybe I would say that.
How do you balance between, because a lot of your research is really personal, right? So how do you balance between, I guess in a way how do you balance between being the vulnerability and the, I guess in a way, the criticality needed in research, right? So like, I don't know, how do you balance the two?
Therapy. I think for me, the first answer that comes to mind is having a really, really good collaborator who also happens to be one of my best friends. Because we can sit in these like topics and understand that these two things like happen in parallel, and are able to bounce back to each other and become a mirror to each other when we are parsing through a lot of of these topics, especially when we're like ideating like a proposal for an exhibition. I think a lot of it is actually like a response to maybe how we're feeling. It's like a live response to how we're feeling as immigrants. Like for example, that performance program, In Our Stillness, Ating Pagtahan, the impetus was to look at the etymology of tahanan and look at where that really comes from. And it's not just like a place to come home to, it's a place to stop crying, it's a place to be still, it's a place to find comfort. And a lot of the migrant experience can be quite lonely, especially if we're like far away from our families and have to kind of recreate a sense of home through different communities, not just with our Filipino friends, but you know, through building other forms of family. And so I think going through that in our own personal lives and figuring out ways to put that in an exhibition, but having someone you can bounce that off with, I think what keeps me and Augustine sane. I think just dialogue.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Does anyone else have a question?
Hi, I'm Alan from Artmaking student. Just a simple question ako. How do you, what can you advise to the young aspiring curator from of different institutions? And being as you as curator, what's the common issue and how you handle that? How you handle that issues?
So when I was in high school in the Philippines, I actually didn't know what a curator was. And I only really learned about the work of a curator when I went to university, and I was stunned that this job actually exists, because I've always been creative and I've always been in the arts. Actually have a background in theater, but not quite like a visual artist. And so finding this role of like kind of the in-between, like the practice and the theory, felt so like kind of perfect for me. I think I would advise an aspiring curator to just go to as many exhibitions as you can. Figure out what kind of art you like and what kind of art you don't like, and ask yourself why you like that art or why you don't like that art, and just go on studio visits. Like if you're in university and you also have friends who are artists, do studio visits with them. And there's really no like a template for how to do a studio visit, but for me, I always ask the artist, like, is there one question you want to ask me about your work? And then we start from there, and then it generates a lot of conversations from there. So I think it starts from a place of curiosity and just practice. And the more you kind of practice and kind of enhance the way that you think and the way that you maybe ask questions and like what kind of curiosities different artists bring up, then that's kind of how you develop your own kind of curatorial language, I suppose. Read a lot. For me, like if there's any topics that I, kind of am more curious in, I always turn to a lot of sociology and anthropology to really contextualize maybe what I'm curious about. At least for me in my curatorial practice, that's important. Other curators have different focuses, but for me, like how can I contextualize like an artwork within other kind of frameworks and thinking. A common issue, resources. And just goes back to the first question of I always have to continually ask myself like why I'm curating and what I'm doing this for, to go back to the ethos of why I believe art exhibitions and art making and bringing artists together is like important in like the in the more social lens, beyond the aesthetics, beyond things looking good, beyond the socializing, like what impact does an exhibition really make. And once you get down to that and kind of figure out what is the least amount of resources that we can put together to make this happen, that's where the work just kind of begins. And I think for us, we were just very lucky also with the context that we existed in, also in the Gulf, maybe that I didn't mention before is that the art scene is extremely tiny, and because of that, there's a lot of access for emerging artists towards institutions. And we were just lucky, we were at a time where things were really shifting, and that's also how we got a lot of access to these institutions. I was also working for an art institution at the time, so that kind of network was very instrumental for us to reach these other institutions. So I acknowledge that the art ecosystem is a little bit unfair in that way, but I think that's also why we started the collective. For me and Augustine is like, okay, if we have access to all of these institutions, how can we open the gate and allow other emerging artists to be able to go in through the door? So I think, yeah, sharing your resources and asking questions and staying curious.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing like a lot of your like work and interests in art. Some of my students here are taking up the creative practice, the subject. Maybe is there like a mindset or attitude that, from your point of view as a curator, could you share with aspiring like artists or creatives? Because I think sometimes they might be intimidated to approach like like a path that you didn't know before. So is there something that you might share, that like a mindset or attitude that they could adapt to approach like paths that might not be known to them, but they could create actually like yours?
Yeah, great question, because when I got into this, I also had no idea what I was doing. I still have no idea what I'm doing. I think that's the biggest, because there's a lot of students here, it's the biggest myth to debunk is we don't know what we're doing. I know I just did a whole presentation about everything that I've been doing, but every time I'm doing it, I don't know what I'm doing. I think it's just, for me, having mentors has been really important, and not just mentors in, like, not just curatorial mentors, but also like professors who have really motivated me and maybe helped steer a lot of my thinking towards the way that I think now. So if you have a favorite professor, keep in touch with them and continue to be like in critical dialogue with them. I think it's extremely important. Like, I'm still in touch with my thesis professor from university, and she's a theater professor, but she's been very instrumental in the ways that I transfer a lot of my theater theory courses or ways of thinking from performance studies into curating. So for me, I think a lot of it is looking at what you're interested in and seeing how that manifests in different ways. I think for me also COVID, since I graduated during COVID, that was a big pivotal moment for me to think about, okay, how does my theater practice manifest somewhere else? And I think it's just, yeah, it's a hard one. I think it's doing it step by step, and I think being in this like experimental kind of mindset really helps take you there, and not being obsessed with the end goal, and kind of enjoying the journey of also learning. Because I feel like with every artist that I work with every curator that I meet, or every writer that I meet, I'm always learning something. So for me, if I don't take anything but that, then I have done like, if I have either that or kind of being able to share more resources to other artists, then I've done my job. So I think, yeah, it's not easy, but I think kind of just sticking with it and also taking your time and taking it slow really helps a lot, and not putting a pressure on yourself that you need to make X amount of exhibitions by this day, or write this amount of articles by this moment. Really kind of, I know it's hard, I need to take the same advice myself, but yeah, I think it's just kind of being in that experimental and learning mode, and yeah, I hope that helps.
Okay, if there are none, let's give Bernice a hand.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited.
So maybe you can tell us what's next for Sa Tahanan Co, or
We're
maybe
resting.
upcoming project.
We're resting. No, I think for us, we're gonna take the next couple of months to work on our archive and really also updating our website. And yeah, thinking a little bit slower. We did a lot of exhibitions last year, which was our 5th year anniversary, which was great. And now just taking some time to recalibrate and thinking about what we do next. I think because Augustine and I spend a lot of our time now in Germany, I think just spending also a lot of time with the diaspora that exists in Europe and continually making connections with other artists kind of within that region and see what comes up. But yeah, rest is important, so we're gonna rest.
Thank you, Bernice.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. We still have some snacks outside. The list was the first batch this morning. But please feel free to stick around for the snacks or you may approach Bernice for questions.
Thank you guys for inviting me.
Thank you.
Ateneo was my dream school when I was 10, so it's really nice to be here.